This is World Watch's program, October the 19th, 1987. The number of the program is 828. And this evening I'm going to talk about war and some more Robinson Jeffers poetry and matters pertaining to war. In 1974, I wrote an article, The SLA is the CIA, and I compared Ronald Reagan's use of terrorism that he was building up with Edwin Meese and Mr. Gufrida from the Federal Emergency Management. In those days, it was called the Garden Splicer plot. They had cooked up with a national network. And their plans, literally, to use terrorism, I believe, to just start World War III. The article sounded very dramatic because I said the kidnapping of Patty Hearst could be comparable someday to the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the very act, the insane act that started World War I. Well, Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, November the 80th. He was elected president. Very few people that I knew in those 6 years believed that such a thing was hardly possible and wondered what in the heck I was writing and talking about. I was on the air all this time from 1971 when he was governor for 3 more years up through 74, and then as he worked his way into the White House. And as soon as it was in the White House, the subjects he concerned himself immediately were not the budget that he campaigned on to balance the budget, not problems with medical conditions or health plans or housing or transportation or education, but terrorism, the very thing that he was groomed on for 8 years and was groomed to put into place as the excuse for our eventually taking as many countries as we can before the planned World War III against the Soviet Union. So at his first meetings with Secretary of State Alexander Haig and the National Security Council, the subject was Libya, Iran, and then Nicaragua, getting the government out and putting in the Somoza government down in Nicaragua. And now we're getting closer to war with the pursuit in the Gulf. The minute we flagged those ships, we were halfway towards Reagan's idea of a good presidency. He often compared himself to Franklin Roosevelt. I've said this over and over, but I think the time is ripe to re-listen to those words and think of what I said. He had the illusion of being a commander-in-chief. He became that. Last week he talked about the War Powers Act not interfering with him because he said, in quotes, "I am the commander-in-chief." And he also thought about Roosevelt's third term, where he was put in based upon the war that we couldn't change presidents at the time of the war. Well, now we have Ronald Reagan in a situation where he's literally backed against the wall. Wall Street Journal and other newspapers last week continued their articles on Reagan's impotence. We have his best friends, Michael Deaver, ready to be before a court of law, possibly prosecuted. Edwin Meese the same. Lynn Nofziger the same. He has a special prosecutor hanging in limbo. No prosecutions yet against his national security advisor, Admiral Poindexter, his best friend and identification expert, Oliver North, who's the great Rambo that Reagan never was, and he never went to war. He has the possible indictment of Oliver North. And then there's that secret team that's worked for this government the past years since the OSS and on up to the present. Albert Hakim, fairly new to the gang. Thomas Klein's an old-timer, 29 years with the CIA. Theodore Shackley, years with the CIA. John Singlaub with the OSS. And all those people are under investigation, are defendants in the Christic Institute suit. So that the very people around him, the people who raised the money for him, Carl Spitz Channel and Richard Miller, all of them are caught into a web and combined the frustration of having all of his administration coming down and at the same time his ambition to lead us into war and realize that flagging the Kuwaiti ships was one step closer towards that war. Now, deals are cut. I'm absolutely convinced long before the wars happen. If Iran hits back and we strike back and get into a major war in the Middle East and we don't know where it's going to lead, and this president is determined never to get out, to stay there so nothing but bad can happen with all those ships and weapons, these deals were cut a long time ago, and I believe that all of us are collectively responsible for watching these steps develop and sitting by and not seeing the significance as they took place. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in 1943 had held back any help for the Soviet Union until they saw that the Soviet Union could resist the Nazis, and then they came in and offered to land troops, because then the Russians were coming west and they didn't want them to have too much influence over all of Europe. So at that point, they came in to help Russia, but Russia was only an ally in name only when they started to be victorious and when it was obvious that they were holding their own against Adolf Hitler. I always talk about the year 1943 or the years 43 to 45, when the seeds were planted for what we're experiencing now and what we are going to experience in the next few years. 43, when Fritz Kramer from Germany recruited Henry Kissinger into military intelligence to join him with top Nazis as soon as the war was over in 1945, when Allen Dulles was sent to head the OSS branch in Bern, Switzerland, to recruit the top Nazis of Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo for the next round, obviously for the next round. That's when William Stevenson of British intelligence moved into the USA to Rockefeller Center to set up our network to blend in with the British intelligence and the British ruling class that had some ideas about Russia as against Nazism, the mass of them favoring Nazism and getting us ready for that mindset in the years that followed. And along those lines of saying this preparation was done way, way back, there was an article this past week in the San Francisco Chronicle based on a new book coming out. The book's called The Nazi Hunters. The author is Chuck Ashman. The Chronicle article was October the 11th, 1987, titled The CIA Tells of Report on Kurt Waldheim. And the gist of the article is that the Central Intelligence Agency has now admitted that they've had access to a top-secret document that would throw the U.S. intelligence officers that they knew. They would show that the U.S. intelligence officers knew before the end of World War II that Kurt Waldheim, with his activities in Greece and Yugoslavia and so forth, that he was involved in Nazi activities. The Chicago Sun-Times is reporting this story this past weekend. A newspaper in Vienna and a magazine disclosed for the first time in the September 4th issue that they quoted certain documents as saying that the Waldheim story shows involvement of him with American agencies before the war was over. Before the war was over, he was linked up to American agencies. The Sun-Times said that the CIA acknowledged there are OSS documents, but they remain top secret. Somebody was protecting Kurt Waldheim till he became the ambassador to the UN, the head of the UN, and then the president of Austria. And this book that is coming out called The Nazi Hunters talks about the activities of Waldheim that were previously known from U.S. Army documents, and the current story that he wasn't discovered as a Nazi until 1948 are now thrown out the window, just as the documentation on finding Eva Braun's teeth or Adolf Hitler's teeth or body. These stories through the years become changed as people surface and say, no, those stories weren't right. We lied about them. Now, this article in this book also referred to a man that I've had mentioned him on World Watchers 2 or 3 years ago. His name is Fritz Molden, M-O-L-D-E-N. He's a publisher of a Vienna newspaper called Die Presse. He's the son-in-law of the late CIA director Allen Dulles, and he was instrumental in bringing Kurt Waldheim into the Austrian Foreign Ministry and managing his career after World War II until he came to the position of being the UN advisor and also then the president of Austria. Allen Dulles, again, who set up his offices in Bern, Switzerland, starting in 1943, and then working with these top Nazis, and they've had many prominent positions. I'm sure this is as important as any, being the head of the UN and also the president of Austria. But it's important because this team of government agents, starting with William Sullivan also of the FBI, working with J. Edgar Hoover, set up operations to merge with Great Britain and to incorporate these particular Nazis, and they've been in our government since before the war was over, May the 8th, 1945. Now, a long listener to World Watchers sent me some poetry because I was talking about Robinson Jeffers and his feelings about Franklin Roosevelt, comparing him to Adolf Hitler. So I want to share those with you tonight. There is a lot of important stories in the news, but nothing is more important than how wars begin and who is behind the wars and what comes from these wars, in lieu of the fact that we had a full approval of the Democrats and Republicans who were consoled by the president that it's okie doke to start bombing away at Syrian bases. And this is both sides of the government. That's called bipartisan agreement that the president is absolutely right in what he's doing in the Persian Gulf, which is very dangerous. So in lieu of the way wars start and what Robinson Jeffers was writing about in 1940, when the seeds of World War II were coming, and what Franklin Roosevelt was doing in 1940 are what I want to share with you, because not only was Robinson Jeffers talking about that from 40 to 43 in 1945, but he was predicting this war that we're going to get ourselves into. It became inevitable when he saw the people around Franklin Roosevelt that were setting the stage. Now, just coincidentally with the Robinson Jeffers broadcast I had several weeks ago and mentioned on the talk show part of the program, the San Francisco Chronicle has a review of a new book of Robinson Jeffers called Rock and Hawk, a selection of shorter poems by Robinson Jeffers. And the reviewer is Tom Clark, and he explains how Jeffers lived in Carmel and was isolated and withdrew from the world. He said that seeing around and beyond the human race, he preferred the rocks and kelp and buzzards, and he rejected modern society and politics and art and also the human race. This is what the reviewer is saying, because he called the human race, and this is true, a botched American species that has run wild and ought to be stopped. It's out of control. And he also said, on a positive sense, but it's never or hardly used enough, he said that Robinson Jeffers also believed that the human beings as a race could be saved if they only preserved what they are now destroying. The only way to save your race is to save the things that you are, in fact, destroying. And that's why he's so popular with the Save the Planet people in the ecology movement now, that what we're destroying is what is going to do away with the human race. And then in conclusion of the review of the book, The Rock and Hawk, this particular person says that Jefferson's poetry was written a long time ago, crusted with blood and barbaric omens, painful to the excess. But, he says, that's because the course of human events that so horrified Robinson Jeffers has ironically proven many of the darkest forecasts to be accurate. Now, what the artist many times see, not all artists, but many times do, or Jeffers saw, was that the course we took with World War I and rebuilding for World War II and the President Franklin Roosevelt was for America what Hitler was for Germany. That's pretty radical to think that. Now, what I want to do is just share some lines or two poems of Jeffers and some lines from his book, and then go to a speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave in 1937, and this is when Jeffers was writing his poetry that set the world, that told Hitler it's okay to rearm, you're on your own, that Roosevelt literally gave him the go-ahead. This speech was reprinted just this past week in the L.A. Herald by a professor at Rice University called The Speech That Gave Hitler the Go-Ahead, given by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Chicago 50 years ago in 1937. Now, Jeffers has many, many poems, and I just want to read a few of lines and poems of his feelings about war. And as I say, then get to the historical period that he was writing it in. And for the historical record, well, I have many books on Roosevelt and that time era. I'm going to read from the newsletters of George Seldes. I consider him the greatest researcher of that time period, or practically of any of our time periods, the original or greatest muckraker. He's still alive today. And read what he was writing in his newsletter about Franklin Roosevelt. At the same time, Jeffers was writing the poetry. And it isn't something that pertains to way back then, 50 years ago or 45 years ago. It's us today on the brink of the Persian Gulf. Robinson Jeffers wrote a short poem called Next Armistice Day. It was written in 1942. That was right after Pearl Harbor, but before we got really heavily into the war, at least the European War, 1942. It said, finally, in white innocence, the fighter planes like swallows dance. The bombers above ruined towns will drop wreaths of roses down. Doves will nest in the guns' throats, and people will dance in the streets. This is 1942, and the armistice was in June 45, May 45, the German war ended, and in August of 45 in Japan. He said, on that great day, the boys will hang Hitler and Roosevelt on one tree, painlessly in effigy, to take their rank in history. Roosevelt and Hitler and Guy Fawkes, hanged above the garden walls, while the happy children cheer without hate, without fear, and new men plot the next war. And it was in 42 and 43 that George Seldes is talking about the plotting of the next war after this war, why we were getting into the war in Europe to keep our troops there permanently against socialism or the Soviet Union. And he wrote they were already plotting the new war, and indeed, Franklin Roosevelt was. He has another poem called Tragedy Has Its Obligations, which is an excellent one, but this is one that this listener sent to me, and I had marked to share with you also. It's called Wilson. That's Woodrow Wilson, the president. Wilson in Hell. Roosevelt died and met Wilson, who said, in quotes, I blundered into it through honest error, and conscience cut me so deep that I died in the vain effort to prevent future wars. But you blew on the coal bed, and when it kindled, you deliberately sabotaged every firewall that even the men who denied my hope had built. You have too much murder on your hands. I will not speak of the lies and conniving. I cannot understand the mercy that permits us to meet in the same heaven. Or is this my hell? And that was written in March of 1944, a year and 2 months before the war was over. And one other poem that is controversial, these are controversial, is called Ethical Note. In Russia, 20 million Russians were deliberately starved to aggrandize the state, and at the moment 10 million are slaves in camps. The ordinary citizen, the iron of the government across his face, is rapturously grateful to be allowed to walk in a park or attend church. And in England, fine freedom is built on conquest. England has robbed, enslaved, exterminated her sisters, holding, she intends, to hold what she has. France, Belgium, and Holland hope to reclaim their empires. America has robbed and exterminated the helpless tribes of the continent, and all her golden Southwest is war spoils. As I was saying, Germany, too, is guilty of war crimes. And where did Germany learn that? In the poem, The Double Axe, he becomes very against war, and this was during the war, and he has, it's a long poem. I want to read just some lines of a person who comes back. He's dead, he's killed in war, and he comes back to his family, and the mother's surprised to see him. She says, my God, you're back again. You killed some Japs? Yeah. He said, no, I got killed, he said, gripping his mother's wrist. There are millions and millions, but as far as I know, I'm the only one that has come back. It's unbelievable. How can they lie so still after being gypped and killed? Gypped by their governments, by their fathers, by their women, gypped out of life, fooled and despised and lied to, and stuck under the mangrove roots and the black mud, under the coral sand and the Russian snow and the cabbages in Europe. They're too submissive. They ought to damn patience and rise. Think of the stinking armies, the semi-skeletons marching on Washington, all those dead that have been killed. Here comes your war. And he was imitating Franklin Roosevelt's use of war. The president's manner of speech. Here is your war. You made it. How do you like it? While the German boys unfox the holes at Berchtesgaden and the little killed nipped their emperor to death, it would be fine. But he said, justice begins at home. So still they have their American Legion suppers, the poor old war hounds, the last Saturday of every month. what a life. I guess we don't lose much by dying young. It's the lies, it's the lies, it's the dirty lies, war peddler lies, and the people's imbecility that raked me out of the grave. By the way, Mother, keep my secret. Don't tell the old man I'm dead. I want to tease him a while. If any person begins to say we have to save England, and here's our president telling us what we have to do right now in the Gulf. If any president begins to say we have to save England or rescue France or avenge the Jews, take him and hang him. He's pimping for war. If he says democracy, remember they pimped for war. They will rise again. Take him and hang him. Or if he says we must save civilization, they said it before. Take him up and hang him. If they say it's my country, right or wrong, they are pimping for war. Take them up and hang them higher than Haman. Hell, we've had a fine orchard when the sun ripes the plums. You'll be there, old man, he went on to say, right along with the president, his old man being his father, right along with the president and his paid mouths and the radio shouters and the writers and the world planners and the heavy bishops and the England lovers and the little poets and the college professors, the seducers of boys, the pimps of death, the pimps stretched all in a row, swing high, swing low. And then he goes on, and they say, what have you done? She turned when he came closer to her and said, your eyes don't shine. It's horrible to hate so much and hate and go over their reasons again. And they have no reason to condemn me to death. And she wants to know about what he's thinking. And he says, well, we rotted in Schofield Barracks while we were sold to death by liars and fools. There is nothing left but to envy and degrade life with our stinking bodies and betrayed minds. I have had joy and freedom sometimes as beautiful as you, Mother, and loved her, referring to somebody he cared for. But who cares? They pushed me down out of the sunlight, out of the decent air, into the dirt and the darkness. I fought back. I am only a bitter will holding up a corpse that walks and hates, even you, Mother. I wish I were back under the damned white crosses between the bush and the seas. They stole my life. I think I might have flowered clean, even to the floor of the cup. My death is not clean, and I haven't told you the half of it. This is a world grown monstrous, rabies-bitten, a nightmare false where millions of men were sacrificed for no reason but vanity, thousands of ships and great fleets of planes with crammed wombs day and night labor over the farthest oceans to debark death, not on armies only, but old women and babies and little dogs, and the worst is coming. Don't say freedom is for foreigners, unless you intend to kill Russia on top of Germany, Britain on Japan, churn the whole world into one bloody bubble bath. Don't say democracy. Don't talk that much and don't pretend that the world will be improved or goodwill earned or peace made perfect by blasting cities and nations into bloody choppets. If you believe that, you believe anything. They are lockable madhouses for fools to simper and howl in while the whole planet's one. And then in this particular poem, he has two more statements here. You needn't be sorry for me. I and you will have a settling. By sorry for the decent and loyal people of America, caught by their own loyalty, fouled, gouged, and bled to feed the power-hungry politicians and make trick fortunes for swindlers and collaborators. For a time is coming fairly soon, you'll not see it, when the ends of the earth from east and west, one world, will close on your country for allowing this. Like the jaws of a trap, he said, people will say, be quiet, we were fooled before. We know all governments are thugs and liars. Let them fight their own battles. The trap is closing, and an angry spirit will go through the camps, whispering mutiny in conscripts' ears. Your rulers are cooking another world war. And this is written in the 42. Come and we'll kill them, and the spirit will be mine. It will scream like an eagle over the mountains, the quisling cities and burning cities, sabotaged airfields, while the enemy makes good his beachheads. But who knows that submission is better than war, he asks. I don't know. And then he talks, as I say, about the decent and loyal people of America in that poem. And he also refers in one poem called Mitching Malacho, which is based after a drama in Hamlet, The Murder of Gonzago, where he refers to, and this is so important, the mischief of the old people over the young. And he begins by saying, wagging their hoary heads, glaring through their bright spectacles, old gentlemen shout for war, while youth, amazed and unwilling and submissive, watch them. And it's not normal. It's really ominous, and it's good comedy. But for a coming time, it means mischief, for the boys have memories. And what he is saying, he's warning of the future, because there's a close relationship between old gentlemen, grandfathers, and elderly fathers who remember war, and young boys who are submissive, they're idealistic, they are thinking of all the happy things that childhood has. But then the time comes when the youth is persuaded to war, and he says it's a tragic occurrence, ominous of more bloodshed, because you are victimized by youth, which is not normal because boys have memories. And all of a sudden, to protect your country or your religion or your area, your piece of geography, you remember what Grandpa said and what Father said, and then the little boy turns into a man, and then the problems begin. And he predicts that this perpetuates the war because while you're silent and you listen, and the president again has those paid mouths, he's the seducer of boys, the pimps of death, that little young people are not told about the peaceful people, the people trying to make peace, but they're fed the stories of war. Now, as I mentioned before, this San Francisco LA Herald had an article beginning in Chicago 50 years ago today, and it's about Franklin Roosevelt giving a speech in 1937 in which he made it quite clear that he would not oppose Adolf Hitler in Germany. He may slap the wrist of Japan going into Manchuria, but the person who wrote this article, Francis Lowenhune, is a professor of history at Rice University, and he said it was clear by this speech in 1937 that the president's outburst in Chicago was directed against Japan, and assuming that there would not be any confrontation in Germany. The Chicago fanfare turned in a call to retreat, with the bad word quarantine no longer mentioned anywhere, and there were no indications that the United States intended to intervene actively in the Far Eastern conflict, let alone in the European conflict. Roosevelt gave this very important speech at that time. And in this article, he's compared to Woodrow Wilson, again, the person that Robinson Jeffers wrote about. And the article says, at home and abroad, public and political opinions seem distinctly favorable to what Roosevelt was saying. But it goes on to say that even the Chicago Tribune briefly moderated its usual harsh anti-Roosevelt position and said the moment came, it editorialized, when Woodrow Wilson found himself with no alternative for war. Does not Mr. Roosevelt's policy invite the coming of the day when he, too, may have no alternative but to resort to arms? That while Wilson didn't have an alternative and it caught him by surprise, he said, I had no alternative. I didn't know what was happening. That Franklin Roosevelt will have no alternative, that even though he thinks he's taking the right choice in that controversial speech, he was giving the green light to Hitler. And the article concludes by saying, November the 5th, 1947, at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Hitler assembled the military chiefs at a 4-hour top-secret meeting and unveiled to them his grand design for the mastery of Europe. Unknown to all but a few Nazi insiders, Europe and America were formally launched on the road to World War II, and Roosevelt was taking a stance that gave Hitler the green light until we entered the theater there in Europe many years later. This was 1937, and our troops landed later. Now, I'll take a 1-minute break in this particular part of the broadcast and go into what was happening in the United States with Franklin Roosevelt when Robinson Jeffers was writing his poetry. Now, for those of you who are interested, there are a lot of good books. John Dodson, who's on Kazoo and reads poetry, is one of the foremost experts on Robinson Jeffers, and his book that I got at the festival, the Jeffers Festival, has a chronological order of Robinson Jeffers' life. And if you take some of the books that are out and see where he lived and his education. He's probably one of the best educated Americans that ever happened to be living in this country, and he settled in Carmel. I'll take a 1-minute break from that subject and remind you that it's your turn at the end of this next half hour to call 375-3082. And this is controversial material, so I want to get on with that now. On Franklin Roosevelt, Robinson Jefferson, to the part of what Roosevelt was doing. Now, as I say, one source on Roosevelt, and I have many, many books on him and on this time period, but I chose George Seldes' books because he had a newsletter, in fact, that came out every week, just as I do World Watchers every week, and all of the things he said are dated, so you can put them into a time slot. So I went back to, in fact, June 30th, 1940. I'll give you the dates of the issues and give you some of the things he was saying when Jefferson was writing his poetry in the anti-Roosevelt poetry in 1942. He said, it is confidentially been revealed that America is going to fight. This is 1940, and Pearl Harbor came December 41. The United States is going to fight in Europe, in Asia also, a long war that will not necessarily result in a satisfactory peace, but it has been determined that the United States must be in Europe to lend weight to the American wishes with respect to the final settlement. The American wishes, meaning the American corporations, want us there when Russia defeats Germany against whatever wall they were going to line them up to before they said, I give up. And the decision was made that we must be there for any final settlement. Therefore, we have to send our troops. And he wrote that Western civilization, in quotes, and evidently this came out of some meeting, must be reserved. The U.S. troops in Europe will defend the system, he wrote, even after socialism or the Soviet communism takes over on some parts of the Europe. He said it is necessary that force of arms be supplemented by underwriting Europe for generations to come to stop socialism, which was the labor unions and communism. So we would be in Europe, and that was the Marshall Plan that was set up, or the British American Canadian Corporation with 800 corporations within 2 days of the end of the war that I've talked about. He wrote that anti-war spokesmen harshly objected to the plans that were being made in America because they had nothing to do with defending democracy, that the troops were being sent there to defend the status quo, and that the administration, they insisted, is only concerned with the status quo in England and France, which means the continuous suppression of labor, cancellation of civil rights, lowered standard of living, dictatorship of the vested interests. Then he wrote, Franklin Roosevelt is anxious to reshuffle his cabinet. This is in 1940. And Franklin Roosevelt decided to make the Secretary of the Navy, that was Mr. Knox, and the Secretary of War Republicans. Now, Herbert Hoover came in his presidency building up the rearmament of Germany and the Polish czarists that came out of the Russian czarists and the Polish very far right-wing group that came out from the Russian Revolution and were being put down. The czarists in Russia then had fled to Germany to help rearm Hitler and help him get going after they had to leave Russia when it became the Soviet Union. And what he's writing about is that it was, even though we had Herbert Hoover, whose whole goal is to rearm the American army for World War III, one of his primary goals with France and Great Britain, the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, had his Republican choices made for Secretary of Navy and War. And Franklin Roosevelt said, I'll have a Democrat in the Labor Department, but we'll use the Republican Party in War and Navy. And they had been called in front of Congress for illegally rearming Hitler ever since the Versailles Treaty that President Wilson wanted to end wars. And then George Seldes wrote in his newsletter that some people in the United States felt that when Franklin Roosevelt merged the Democratic Party with the Republican Party, that coalition would kill the two-party system. And that is exactly when the two-party system ended, and decisions of war and defense were bipartisan, as Ronald Reagan likes to call it, but the heads of both parties allow Vietnam and the horrors of South Korea or the coups in all the various countries, 30 or 40 of heads of states we've killed. Both parties are part and parcel of it, and starting with Franklin Roosevelt, his Secretary of War and those important posts of Navy and War were run by the Republicans. And then when John Kennedy was in, he did the same thing with Allen Dulles and Dean Rusk and McNamara, the same group that worked with the Republican administrations before when he was president. He put them in as part of his cabinet. So what George Seldes is saying, that people in the Republican and Democratic Party feared that Franklin Roosevelt would kill the two-party system, and then it may leave open for a third party, which is the one we never had, that is truly anti-war, pro-peace, pro-labor, pro-social legislation and outlook. Those are the things that get the shaft, while the $40 trillion in the last 40 years went to war. And George Seldes wrote about the fifth column. He described it as being a name given by Franklin Roosevelt to the Martin Dies Committee to advocates of peace, to break down advocates of peace and labor organizations and civil liberties. They became the new spies. Now, there's an interview in this same newsletter, 1940, called We Built the Nazi Air Power, from George Seldes, that said the United States with Great Britain has been accused of aiding the Nazi military power before the war broke out. And this is 1940. In fact, his newsletter, reprinted here, hearings from the Naval Affairs before the United States Senate on the nomination of William Knox to be Secretary of the Navy. Knox worked with Herbert Hoover and with the War Department, and Franklin Roosevelt made him Secretary of the Navy, and he was called by a Senator Homer Bone in Washington about the rearming of Hitler going on from 1934 and 1935. This one hearing, but other hearings went back even earlier to 1922. And Bone said, I'm pointing in 1934 and 35, Hitler was supplied hundreds of the finest airplane engines manufactured in this country. And Colonel Knox, who's to become the Secretary of the Navy, said, I know they bought our engines, yes. Bone, they bought hundreds of them. Knox says, I saw them myself in Germany. I was there. Bone, they were sold through the Bavarian Motor Works. And Knox says, I saw the whole trainload of them. I saw our engines in Hitler's Germany, and now he's the Secretary of the Navy to be. Not only that, they bought the patent rights, the building rights to the engines from the American manufacturers to the German government with the consent of the government. Is there any doubt in your mind about that? And he said, well, I didn't know about the consent of our government, but I know these engines were sold. And Representative Bone says, you're aware under the Versailles Treaty that Germany was forbidden to rearm in that fashion. He said, oh, yes, I was aware of it. But then I went to make sure in Germany to see what we were selling them. And he was appointed by Roosevelt to be Secretary of the Navy. Another part of Seldes' newsletter of 1940, July 29th, is called U.S. Aids Hitler. High officials of the United States State Department betrayed democracy every day by refusing visas for non-political as well as anti-fascist refugees who up till 1940 were trying to leave foreign prison camps, particularly in France, when the League of American Writers requested the State Department to rescue noted writers in 1940 or earlier from Hitler's terror. It was turned down. The League learned that the American officials were putting severe pressure on Bolivia, Chile, and other countries to cancel their being able to travel to those countries. Our State Department was stopping them, but the State Department managed Lady Mendel of England to arrive by the Clipper. She arrived alone with 2 dogs on an overcrowded refugee ship. She came, but then many applicants were put aside because her dogs came later with a secretary, and Lady Mendel's dogs arrived. Writers from Europe couldn't come that were fighting fascism. In fact, August 12, 1940, George Seldes writes, Americans armed Hitler and financed fascism, and it goes into the role of J.P. Morgan, and Franklin Roosevelt was very close to the Morgan group while he was president of the United States, the munitioners DuPont, Pratt & Whitney, Curtis Wright, Douglas, and he said the fascism is the same today as it was in 1925, 1930, 1939, we're up to 1940. The anti-fascists said years ago, Fascism means war. Fascism is the aggressor. It eventually threatens American interests, but America is supplying them with guns and money, and we are besieged by fascists in our own State Department during now the Democratic regime, formerly the Republican machine. Nothing has stopped. And this article goes into J.P. Morgan as the chief backer of Mussolini's fascism and hoping that Hitler would win his aggression against Russia, and the use of Dillon. Mr. Dillon was head of J.P. Morgan. He was assistant to Bernard Baruch on the War Industries Board, and he was instrumental helping Dillon Reed send millions of dollars to Hitler. The biggest loans to German firms came, it listed one of $7 million from Germany and another $48 million from I.G. Farben. And then the American companies of the Dillon Reed also put in money, including J.P. Morgan made allowances for $30 million for Mussolini through a bank in Milan, and $30 million. Then Seldes wrote in 1940, August 23rd, titled, Roosevelt Quits the Writers' League. For 2 years, Franklin Roosevelt, as the writer of several books, was known to 800 members of the League of American Writers as a colleague. The League never tried to gain publicity from Roosevelt's membership. 3 or 4 months ago, which would be in the summer of 1940, Roosevelt definitely abandoned the New Deal at that time when he resigned from the League. The League's chief activity was fighting fascism, Native American fascism that masquerades as super patriotism at home, and foreign brand of the Cliveden set in London and 200 French families. The League recently issued a statement on peace with 350 writers signing it, and well-known writers, and the League is investigating the people who were, not allowed also to come to this country, but they listed these various writers, and then suddenly Franklin Roosevelt resigns and says, I am no longer a member of the Writers' League. Then, in fact, October 21st, 1940, Americans' real enemies, and it tells about another 15 million that was sent to Adolf Hitler by the United States government, and he said the FBI has a great record with kidnappers. Seldes was laughing about that, but it has fouled his nest by raiding the Spanish loyalist veterans. Neither Martin Dies, the FBI, nor Franklin Roosevelt made any investigation of the friends of Hitler, Mussolini, and the real fifth column in the United States. Fascism in high places is allowed by the FBI and Franklin Roosevelt. But on the other hand, while money is being sent to Hitler and it's being used in the United States for red baiting, Seldes wrote, 7,000 American guns were sent to Hitler, going back further to 1923 to 33, directly to Hitler from Americans, not German Americans. From Americans, 7,000 Thompson machine guns were sent. There were only 21,000 of them made, and 7 went to Germany, and they were used for the brown shirts, that's the Freikorps, in capturing the streets of Munich and Berlin. That was the time period of 1922 to 33 that American guns were sent, and the Freikorps looked like a small group acting in terrorism on their own that were actually linked to their government and our government. And then he continues in this newsletter, October 21st, 1940. As early as December 1922, Hitler was corresponding with Henry Ford. Ford had a picture of Hitler over his desk. Hitler had Henry Ford's over his. And Ford gave money to Nazi Germany, to Hitler. And I mentioned last week the obituary of Henry Ford II, how the Ford Motor Company at one time was just about to go bankrupt. And he was, I believe, Yale University, and he got an exemption from going into the service by Franklin Roosevelt personally so that he could keep the Ford Motor Company going, and they were the origin of the American anti-Semitism, the elders of the prodigal of Zion, and of course, George Seldes' newsletters are filled with that. Then he wrote in the same issue, November 4th, 1940, Roosevelt and the Money Bags, and he says, it was not until 1940 that the Americans, 10 million organized workers, liberals, and progressives, began to question Franklin Roosevelt's appeasement policies for big business, and big business, of course, was part of funding Hitler. Roosevelt was elected November 4th, 1933, And by 1940, 7 years later, the men claim that they have lost the presidency, that the corporations have bought the presidency, and according to Paul Ward, Roosevelt was, in quotes, laboring under the scenes to make peace with the giants of industry and finance who are supposed to be the antagonists, and into the White House slipped those people from Chrysler, from Standard Oil, from U.S. Steel, those persons sending millions and millions of dollars, of course, over with approval of the American government to assist Adolf Hitler. And in 1980, a newsletter came out, George Seldes, about Roosevelt's turning against the labor unions and being angry at he pretended to be progressive, but he was breaking up then the CIO, that was before the AFL-CIO, and Mr. Lewis, and he was destroying the labor unions. And what was worse, he was going along with Herbert Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, using the labor unions to develop spy catalogs on Americans who were part of picketing, or referred to as union agitators. And in the newsletter of 1940, November 18th, titled "FBI uses FDR uses FBI against labor," this is what he wrote: "Evidence of the fact that Franklin Roosevelt is now planning to smash the progressive labor movement is the secret activity of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, who once devoted himself again to kidnappers and later took on political affairs and is now attacking labor." And remember that, some of you don't remember, that J. Edgar Hoover was vice president of Interpol, the international police set up by Adolf Hitler, and he had to step out of there and take away the pictures of Hitler's hierarchy in the FBI office in the United States when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. Up to that time, our police and Adolf Hitler's police were simpatico and exchanged the operations known as Interpol. This article goes on. J. Edgar Hoover started a file of 5 million people back in, this is 1940, including practically all liberals and all progressives and intellectuals. And that's where Robinson Jeffers fits in with the intellectuals, the writers. We can be harsh at what he's saying now until we open the newspapers of what he was seeing when he was writing the poetry, and nobody can doubt the intellectual capacity of Robinson Jeffers. J. Edgar Hoover was putting a list on all liberals, progressives, intellectuals, nonconformists, as well as radicals. The G-men went to every strike. They went to every labor meeting. The activity of Roosevelt's FBI against labor was exposed by Mr. Ward, a Guild reporter, an organ of a union newspaper, who charged that the General Intelligence Division of the First World War, that allegedly disbanded in 1924 because of public indignation, has been revived. This is similar to Western Goals, allegedly the LAPD throwing material away they were supposed to destroy, and we found it in the files of Western Goals going into the Defense Department in 1983, the $100,000 computer in a garage in Los Angeles, in Long Beach, and files were never destroyed. They're passed on. And this person is reporting that files were supposed to be destroyed in 1924, but Herbert Hoover joined them again. He fingerprinted employees in war material plants. He claims he had, in 1940, 4,800,000 fingerprint cards that belonged to criminals. He identified the criminals as somebody who picketed, someone who agitated a union, or in one instance, I keep calling the J. Edgar Hoover, charged that Reds were threatening to close down American factories and air plants would be a danger to the war. And this continues with the tacit approval of Franklin Roosevelt of what J. Edgar Hoover was doing in this time period. Another story about General Motors, a liaison in Europe to Germany. His name is James Mooney, the liaison officer of the United States Defense Department in 1940. It's titled "Mooney Keeps His Nazi Medals." And George Seldes writes, General Motors apparently is flooding a nation with mimeographed defense of its overseas president, James Mooney, the liaison officer to the U.S. Defense Department, who holds Hitler's swastika decoration. It was given to foreign and distinguished persons in the business field, such as Mr. Watson of IBM and Mr. Ford of Ford Motor Company. And Mr. Mooney wears this decoration. He said he can't break with Hitler. This is 1940. He still hopes to salvage his Opel auto plant, which for years was making war material. And Mr. Knudsen, Mooney, General Motors, and stockholders made millions of dollars from Hitler's war preparations in making these weapons. And they did not denounce Hitler. And this article tells how the head of General Motors wears his Nazi emblem while he worked for the United States Defense Department. Now, the part that merges the period of Allen Dulles with the OSS and William Stevenson is written about in great length in George Seldes' documents about England and the mentality of the Great Britons just before they sent William Stevenson over to shape our thinking, because we would be in Europe to shape Europe after the war for the particular multinational corporations or banks. It had nothing to do with democracy. It had with keeping the status quo. That's why these people died in those fields, 80 million of them, so that these people who didn't die could hold on to their wealth. And that's what will happen in the Persian Gulf, to make it timely and think about who gets knocked out there. And the same directors of this game or this drama sit back and watch it unfold. In fact, January 13th, 1941, he reprinted a report, a 108-page report, written by our ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy, who was then removed as ambassador because J. Edgar Hoover said that he was too pro-Nazi. Joseph Kennedy was so Nazi that it would give America a bad name. But before he left the State Department, he wrote a report that said England is proceeding rapidly towards fascism and the Nazi model, that fascism cannot be sold to the British people without the enthusiastic support of the Minister of Labor, Ernest Bevin. That's all they had to get over, was the enthusiastic support of labor, and they'd be home free, and that the people, the working people, are paying for the war while the government makes great concessions to the industrialists, the munition makers, and the big businessmen. Now, if you don't think that applies today, just buy New Fortune magazine and Forbes magazine and see the new billionaires, the new many billions, over billions, and realize their relationship to the defense industry. And Joe Kennedy wrote a report about the mindset of Great Britain. Another article he wrote in 1941, General and admirals prepare to fight fascism. That was the motto that Jeffers was so skeptical of, while they wear decorations awarded to them by Mussolini. And he writes, one of the real differences between Woodrow Wilson's road to war in 1914 and 1917, Wilson again, and the Roosevelt road to war in 1939 to date, is that the general public in Wilson's time did not know what was happening. Whereas today, and he's saying 1941, it is publicly announced that the president is waiting for public opinion to swing into line for convoys and eventually for the bloodshed as part of the war. And doesn't this sound like us? And they're waiting for the approval of both parts of the Congress to get us into the Gulf, where we are reflagged, waiting for this confrontation. And this article goes into the leading Democrats who are now working for the government or the Defense Department, who are propagandizing for convoys and intervention, preparing to lead the American Army and Navy into what they call a war of democracy, and scores of those people openly support Nazism, fascism ideology, the programs of the Nazis, the aims of the Nazis, and they are possessed of the same mentality of the Nazis as they go into the war. The leading recipients of the swastika medal from Hitler are well known, such as Henry Ford, Mooney of General Motors, Thomas Watson of IBM, Colonel Lindbergh, who got his after reviewing the Nazi Air Force and telling the British that Hitler would defeat them. Ford, Mooney, and Watson got theirs as distinguished foreigners who deserved well of the Reich. Mussolini's highest award to Americans, the Grand Cordon of the Crown of Italy, was given to Claude Swanson, Secretary of the Navy, to Admiral Stanley, and to General Douglas MacArthur at the time that he was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. And Douglas MacArthur had as Chief of Intelligence Mr. Charles Willoughby, otherwise known as Kurt Wiedenbach, from Germany, who attended Hitler's Krieg Academy with Albert Wiedemeyer to get ready for the Nazification of the United States when the war was over. As Seldes saw, and people wrote up in 1940s, we would dabble into Europe to make sure we were there so that those vested interests of the United States and Britain or France or whatever would share in the piecing together to keep the steel and the thing that they manufactured there, whatever it was they grew or manufactured, in the hands and control of us. The Marshall Plan would bring in the money to rebuild these plans, and the reason the OSS hired the Waffen-SS was to smash the labor organizers, the resistance people, the anti-war people, the same people that Franklin Roosevelt was using J. Edgar Hoover for to make lists on, the intellectuals, the labor movement, and so forth. And then George Seldes has a long section about the truth of Rudolf Hess and his friends, and about an organization called the Fellowship, and the link of a fellowship to American organizations such as Lazard Brothers, the Vickers Munitions, Thomas Cook, the Lever Brothers, and Hitler's organizations, and the American corporations and British corporations, the Cliveden set, that all merged together. And that is a little bit of overview of why Robinson Jeffers wrote what he wrote and why he felt like he felt, because he was a product of his time. If George Seldes was writing about these things, Robinson Jeffers was seeing them too, and he was seeing the hypocrisy, the way we were led into these situations, arming from 1922 to 23, and then all of a sudden declaring Hitler the bad man. And of course, Robinson Jeffers was educated in Greece and studied Latin and Greek, and lived in Switzerland and went to schools there in England and Scotland, and lived in Europe a very long time before he settled in Carmel and watched this world practically blow itself up, and he knew, this was written before the end of World War II, that we would begin embroiled in a war again for the same excuses, the very same excuses that were used from the time of the Greeks and the Romans and Napoleon and all the wars. He knew the sound, the voices, the speeches, and where it would lead. Well, now I'm going to conclude this part of World Watchers by thanking Coast Components. It's 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past hour of World Watchers. The previous hour of World Watchers was also made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For information, call 438-7400. We'll take a 1 or 2 minute break, and then I'll be back with you for the second half of the program.